All right, we will go ahead and get started. Just a few housekeeping. So tonight, this evening, you are here for the breakfast garden portion of the Garden to Table series through UT Extension, Washington County. Just a few things to make this Zoom experience enjoyable for everyone. Please be sure your microphone is on mute. If you do have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat box and we will answer at each of the end of the presentations. Adam Watson will go first, and then so while we're kind of transitioning in some things, you'll be able to ask questions then, and he'll be able to answer those for you. This session is being recorded. And it will be shared on YouTube. You just got to give us a week or so because I'm learning some editing software to edit out some things on previous ones. And so if you don't want to be seen in the Zoom or on the YouTube recording, just make sure that your cameras are turned off. So the information that's within this class is for educational purposes only. Reference to commercial products or trade names does not imply endorsement by UT Extension or bias against those not mentioned. So I will hand it over to Adam.
All righty, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen and bring up the presentation. Thank you for joining us. I will echo everything that Elizabeth said. And let's see here. And so what we're going to talk about tonight are some things we might be growing in our garden that we would find useful in regards to the breakfast menu. And so we'll cover a few different things and talk about some different possibilities. For those of you who haven't been with us before, I'm Adam Watson. I'm an agriculture agent in the Washington County Extension Office, so happy to be with you. One important thing I think it goes with mentioning, despite the planned weather for this week, we're not quite summer yet, but we're almost ready to start planting out our warm season crops. And so what are we talking about? These are things like everything from beans, tomatoes, peppers, everything like that, melons. Those can be planted out about May 10th in our area. The reason we would wait till that first or second week of May, and I'll be the first to admit, May 10th is probably a little bit conservative, but I'd rather be a little bit conservative and miss a last frost event as opposed to get caught with one by being a little bit too optimistic. But certainly by May 10th, that's a good date for our warm season crops. That also makes sure that our soil temperatures are good and warm, because a lot of these plants or seeds that we're putting out, if you put them out too early, one thing that happens is they're going into cooler soil temperatures. And cooler soil temperatures basically doesn't let them grow much. So even though you may be planting them out a week or two earlier and thinking you're really getting a head start on the season, they're not going to do a lot at those cooler temperatures. So oftentimes we actually get a better start to the season just by letting those crops wait to go out until a little bit later. So certainly the first 2 weeks of May is a good time in our region. Doesn't mean there's zero chance of a frost event happening, but it does mean our soil temperatures are warmer and the likelihood of having a frost event is much less likely. If we're talking about a vegetable garden, we do want to consider a few things about where we place it in the garden. So looking at full sun locations, and by that we mean at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. Certainly, if it gets a little bit less than that, we can squeak by. But if you're in an area that's very heavily shaded and doesn't get a lot of full direct sun, it's probably not going to be the best location for our garden plants. So we would want to reconsider planting a vegetable garden in that area. We do want to avoid being real close to trees for a couple things. Of course, first shade, but also root competition. So the roots of trees go out a large distance, and those are in direct competition for nutrients and especially with water. So in drier times, we can see some significant disadvantage for that vegetable garden if it's competing with established trees. We'd like the area to have well-drained soil. And what we mean by that is that water doesn't pond there. It doesn't, stay wet for a really long time after rains. Certainly, if we have areas that maybe aren't ideal with drainage, maybe they're a little bit wetter than we like, we can do some things such as, creating raised beds in the garden itself. And let me explain that I don't mean necessarily the very formal, very nice constructed raised beds where we bring in potting soil or topsoil and fill those. Certainly, that could be an option. But even just building a raised mound on the ground where you're going to be planting, just a couple of inches of height difference can help improve drainage. So maybe if you have some soils that are a little bit on the wetter side, creating raised beds on the ground just to give a little bit of elevation can improve that. Certainly, we can use the more formal raised beds that we fill with soil or potting media or even containers. That can often let us maybe have a garden in a place that otherwise isn't conducive to doing so. So certainly there's some options for us. Also, always just like to remind people we really don't want to grow over septic drain fields. Generally speaking, I don't think we'd have issues with the plants, negatively affecting those drainage systems. However, if there were to be something wrong, something goes wrong with the drain field, there is perhaps a chance of exposure to sewer materials, which we don't want with things we are eating. So it's just best to stay away from septic drain fields. And certainly we wouldn't want to put tractors or heavy equipment like that on those areas anyway. So generally it's a good rule of thumb just to stay away. Level areas are perfect and great, but realistically in our region, we know that we have a lot of areas that aren't level. So certainly we can grow on areas that have slopes. Just pay attention to concerns with erosion or the movement with soil when we have rain events. So trying to keep that soil covered as much as we can with things like mulch is a very good ideal. Limiting our tillage to when we have to absolutely do it in these situations is also a good best practice. Ideally, we would have access to a water source for our gardens. And that's simply because most any given year, at some time during the season, your garden is going to benefit by you having access to water and making it easier for you to provide supplemental irrigation. Doesn't mean that you can't have a garden if you don't have a water source, but certainly gives you often a better yield. And occasionally, in those very extreme dry years, it can actually be a difference between some yield or none at all. So access to water is great, and when we can have it where we can easily run a hose, it's much easier than trying to carry water or otherwise move it any distance. And one thing I always like to encourage people is garden at your residence if possible. I know often folks may have some land out in the country or even a friend or relative that lets you garden on their land. That's certainly convenient. But it's been my experience that when folks have direct access to it, and the more often they have that direct access to it, the better the outcome. So keeping something close by where you can really sort of monitor it at least daily, or every other day, and just make sure things are going to plan. Oftentimes, when there is something going wrong with your garden, if you find it early enough, there are some corrective things that can be done. So having that proximity close to you is always a good thing when possible. One thing that can get away from any of us, weeds. Certainly, we want to be proactive with weeds because one of the biggest problems we find is when we allow weeds to go to seed, it creates problems down the road. There's kind of an old saying in gardening, 1 years of weeds is 7 years of weeding. That's probably very conservative because what happens is weeds and actually most wild plants, oftentimes when they have their seeds, not everything germinates the next season. So we save and have, developed these varieties of vegetables, for instance, so that anytime we plant the seeds, basically, the goal is near 100% germination. Well, these more wild plants, actually, they don't do that. It's a survival mechanism. So not all the seeds will germinate next year. And so what happens is whenever these weeds go to seed, we have seed that is going to be viable there for perhaps even decades in some instances with some of these plants. So if we can keep weeds from going to seed, we solve future problems. We also, we can pay attention to what's happening around our garden. So oftentimes gardens are in back areas or border areas of our property, and maybe they don't get quite as maintained quite as well as the front yard, for instance. But if we can keep border areas around our gardens weed free, we actually help prevent movement of weed seed in from that direction. Also, that can help limit somewhat areas that might harbor pest insects, for instance. So there's some other benefits just beyond weeds. If we're going to be bringing in something like manure, which has the capacity to contain weed seeds, we would really want to only be using products that are either very well composted or otherwise treated so they were sterile. That way, we're not importing weed problems. So certainly, sometimes free manures are attractive to us because the price is great, but we have to make sure that we're not bringing in future weed problems with those. By the same token, anytime we're using any other mulches, we want to make sure that it's not going to have a weed seed. So, I have seen before where people have bought straw bales, wheat straw, and then you look at them later and suddenly that wheat straw is actually full of wheat seedlings because it either wasn't threshed or at least wasn't well threshed. So there was a lot of seed in there. And while weed itself is not too pernicious of a weed in the garden, it can be a hassle. So certainly what sort of mulch we're using and making sure it's not bringing in weed seeds important. Also, real quickly, just want to mention fertility. Uh, and also, fertility for plants is not just talking about fertilizers. Certainly, they're a great tool and they're good to use, but things like compost and manures, when they're not posing an issue with weed seeds, for instance, are great because those organic matter type fertilizer or soil amendments, what's so great about them is they are adding organic matter to our soils. What organic matters do is they feed the biology of the soil, so all the microorganisms and everything that are there help make our soils healthier, help with nutrient cycling. The organic matter allows for better retention of nutrients as well as better water holding capacity. All of those are pluses for our garden. So anytime we can add organic matter, it's always a good thing. So don't rely just on fertilizers, but certainly fertilizers are a tool that help us. I also want to stretch that we want to be careful when it comes to fertilizers, not to over apply and not to under apply. Certainly, under applying, we can understand fairly regularly, fairly easily that we're not going to have what the plant needs, and so it's not going to give us the production we would like. The problem with too much fertilizer is sometimes the crop doesn't grow in a manner we like. So, for instance, peppers are kind of the poster child for this, in as much as if you provide peppers with excessive amounts of nitrogen, you can have these absolutely beautiful, large, lush, dark green plants and no peppers. Because what happens is too much nitrogen encourages the plant to grow purely vegetatively, and it never switches over to growing for reproduction or flowering. And because there's no flowers, there's no pepper fruit for us to harvest. So, certainly paying attention to how much of a fertility product we're using is important. I always say that, if possible, doing a soil test every 3 to 5 years in the home garden is useful, particularly if you're starting out new. It gives you a starting point, lets you know what's happening, and it's just a great way to start. But certainly, it's not something we would advise people do every year, but it is a good tool to have. If we're not using a soil test or if it's been some time since we've had it, typically what we would look at applying is about 0.4 pounds of actual nitrogen per 100 square feet of garden. So less than half a pound of actual nitrogen, which probably leads you to ask, what in the world is he talking about when he says actual nitrogen? So it has to do with the content of the fertilizer product we're using. So here's an example with that pre-plant rate I mentioned of 0.4 pounds. Let's say we have a fertilizer, and on the fertilizer there's three numbers on the bag. And so it's a 20, 21, 22 fertilizer. Let me first say this is a fictitious fertilizer, so please don't go to the store asking for this because they're probably going to look at you weird. If they find out I told you to come look for it, they're really going to look at me weird. This is just a made up fertilizer, but what it is, those numbers correspond to different nutrient contents. And so the first number refers to nitrogen content, the second number refers to phosphorus, and that third number refers to potassium. And so, for instance, if we're trying to apply 0.4 pounds of actual nitrogen per 100 square feet, that means this product, the 20, 21, 22 fertilizer, is 20% nitrogen. So we would actually apply 2 pounds of that fertilizer over 100 square feet, because 20% of 2 pounds is 0.4 pounds of actual nitrogen. And so what that allows us to do is then figure out the actual application rate, where if you just applied half a pound of this fertilizer, you would be under applying the nitrogen needs. And so understanding what content of fertilizer or other fertility products you're using helps you be able to apply an appropriate amount for the needs of the plant. So that's why we talk about actual nitrogen. It's referring to the content of nitrogen of the specific fertilizer product, and it does vary based on what product we're using. So jumping into a few crops that makes sense to talk about at this time of year, tomatoes. And I realize you've probably seen tomatoes out all over the place in retail centers and grocery stores. But honestly, we're just now getting to where we're almost ready to plant those out. Again, to me, if you want to be a little adventurous, we can say first week of May. If you want to be a little more cautious, say after May 10th. One thing I want to stress, and it's something I'm seeing a lot in the industry, there are larger and larger plants available for transplanting. You do not have to have a large transplant to be successful with tomatoes in our area at all. So certainly a large plant may get to fruit a little bit faster. And the reason I say it reluctantly and say may is because small transplants, younger transplants, establish and grow really fast in our garden. So, certainly we think, well, a large plant's going to be closer to harvest, but the reality is that larger plant's not going to establish quite as quick in the garden. And so the difference between a small plant and a large plant would probably be not as dramatic as you might first think. So certainly don't think you have to buy large, expensive plants. I myself, I like buying the ones that are like 6 to a pack, 4 to a pack, where they're a good size for transplanting, but they're not expensive. And certainly you can have great success with those. One thing to be aware of, if you're, especially sometimes whenever we grow our own plants, we may have some tomatoes that get a little long or leggy, as folks will say. Um, and there's one thing you can do with only tomato plants, and this is unique to tomatoes in the garden and virtually every other aspect too, even on the ornamental side. Most things when we grow transplants, we always say, always plant at the same depth they were growing in the original pot. And as a rule of thumb, it doesn't fail. But tomatoes give us the option of burying the stem. And so if we have a taller plant, we can actually bury that stem. We would want to pinch off the leaves that are on the lower stem that will be buried. And so we can bury it. I have seen where some people will say they plant tomatoes with post hole diggers, going very deep with holes and planting very tall plants. I would probably not suggest you do that because our roots for plants need oxygen. And the deeper we go into the soil, the harder it is for those roots to get oxygen. So burying a plant very deeply probably is not that beneficial. Instead, if you have a long stem on a tomato plant, you can certainly bury it horizontally. And that's one way to actually get a greater root mass on that plant quickly. But don't bury them very deeply. If you're more than 10 inches deep, there's probably going to be marginal benefit to doing that. Because again, most plants, whether trees or vegetables, we find a majority of their roots in the top 10 to 12 inches of the soil. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to dig deep holes for tomatoes. They do quite well even with more shallow holes. I do encourage folks to look at doing some sort of staking or caging for tomatoes. It's a great way to keep the tomatoes off the ground. It can help you with picking. And so I always encourage it. I will say just make sure that you have a sturdy enough cage. I like this picture because, yes, the wire cages do a good job of corralling that plant. And certainly as it starts growing up through it, you can make sure that the branches are coming out or going in where you want them to on that cage, but also they have wooden stakes there. That wire cage itself would not support the full weight of that plant as it matures. So having stakes and tying that flimsy cage to those sturdy stakes is a good way to do it. So certainly caging can work well. Just make sure that you have a sufficient anchoring system to handle the weight. We do want to pay attention to spacing with tomatoes. So if you don't want to worry about this, you can just say space them 24 inches apart within the row. and about 60 inches between rows. So if you've ever grown tomatoes, and as you start getting to the end of the season, you basically just have this big jungle of tomatoes, and you're not sure where the row middle went to, and you've got to push your way in to harvest, you were probably planting a little bit close. And you likely were planting indeterminate tomatoes. If you want to use the terminology of determinate and indeterminate, that's fine. But for me, it's easier. I just call determinate bush tomatoes because basically that's what they are. They grow to basically about 3 feet tall and then stop. The good thing about them is they're better for smaller areas. They also have good yields, not quite as much as indeterminate because indeterminate grow all season long. But because they grow all season long, they get physically larger and take up more room. Determinates also will have their harvest in a smaller window, meaning that from when you start getting fruit to when the plant stops producing, is shorter period of time than indeterminate. So oftentimes if people are trying to plan ahead for canning or things like that, they may plant determinate just so they have more within a shorter time frame rather than canning all season long. But some people do exactly the opposite. So just think of determinate as being bush tomatoes with a little bit smaller growing habit, and indeterminate a bigger plant that yields over a longer period of time. I always encourage people to use mulch with tomatoes and to water more evenly. And so, what do I mean by water evenly? So, blossom end rot is a common problem with tomatoes, and a lot of people knows that it's related to calcium. But the key to understanding how to deal with it is understanding how calcium actually gets into that tomato plant and ultimately the fruit. And that's through the water that the plant is taking up. So what happens is if you just water once a week or something like that, and we're having dry weather, that plant, every time you go to water, it starts growing really, really fast because it finally got everything it needs. The challenge is it didn't have the ability to be pushing calcium all week long. And so because we have up and down moisture levels, we get to situations where we have lack of calcium available for that very rapidly growing fruit. And so that's what happens. The cell walls basically don't glue together well because there's a lack of calcium. And that's why we have the damage that we see. So mulch helps to preserve moisture in the soil. It lowers soil temps. And so we like to use it for that in addition to weed benefits. But watering more frequently in the garden, so whether rather than watering just a single time in a week, watering 2 or 3 times is a good plan because it helps to have a more stable, even amount of water available so that those tomatoes are growing at a more average rate and they're always bringing in that calcium to that plant. In our area, it's not a literal lack of calcium in the soil that causes blossom end rot. It's uneven watering. So just keep that in mind. And if we are talking about watering plants, we do want to make sure that we avoid wetting the foliage of the plant, and water the soil. One, it's a little more efficient with water use, but the other thing is wet foliage promotes diseases. So anytime we can prevent wet foliage and we can encourage dry conditions on that part of the plant, we are avoiding conditions that promote disease. So it's always a good practice. Peppers are another one that's about ready to go out in the garden. I will mention that if you're ever looking at growing transplants from seed yourself, just be aware that peppers take longer than most other plants. So something like a tomato, 6 to 8 weeks. Something like a pepper, 8 to 10 weeks. So they are a little bit slower growing as transplants before we set them out. So just be aware of that. Give yourself some extra time. Um, just again, that rule of thumb that this time does apply. Plant them at the same depth they were growing as transplants. And one thing I do want to mention on these is that pepper plants will not cross in your garden and change from a hot pepper to a sweet pepper this season. So occasionally people will say, well, I planted out some hot peppers, I planted out some sweet peppers, they crossed, and now I've got all hot peppers. The actual fruit part that we eat on the pepper is coming only from the mother plant. So the act of cross pollination does not influence its qualities this season when we eat it. Now, those seeds contained inside there, they can certainly be crossed. And so we could have seeds in a sweet pepper that next season will produce a hot pepper. But you can't turn a sweet pepper plant fruit hot by having it cross pollinated by hot pepper plants. Because again, the only part of that plant that it contributes anything to is the actual physical seed, not the fruit. So just be aware of that. Certainly, if you have mislabeled plants, you can think you're planting a sweet pepper, ended up with a hot pepper, but it's not due to cross pollination this season. It actually would have been cross pollination last season that caused that to happen in the seed itself. Sweet potatoes are another one that is a heat-loving plant. So we're not going to plant these out probably any earlier than the middle of May around here. So still a few weeks for these. And we're planting these out. We're not really doing transplants per se. You see them pictured there. Those are actually rooted cuttings that go out. And I know those look very scraggly and certainly not very, you know, eager to be growing, but plant those in the garden, water them in well, and they do great. So it's a very rapidly growing plant. It is a vining crop. It does need some room, not a whole lot of disease or insect pest. We do want to stay away from wet areas. We can run into some problems with that if we're putting them in a wet area in the garden. Uh, but really, once they are established in our garden, once they've had several weeks, they are rather drought tolerant, and certainly lack of water is going to reduce their growth and their ability to yield. But overall, they're a rather drought tolerant plant that we can grow in our gardens, and certainly they can produce well in our region. And there's a lot of variety out there. So if you're not real familiar, there's white sweet potatoes, there's the orange or golden sweet potatoes, there's even purple ones. So there's a lot of variety out there. Some of them have a little bit different flavor, a little bit different culinary uses. So you may want to experiment with some of those. Cool season crops, by and large, we have passed our window. So cool season, we plant in the spring, and then many of them again in the fall, but not all of them. And so this is a chart I just pulled real quickly out of our cool season guide that you'll receive in links that get sent to you after this is over. And so it's just a great reference. We also have it for warm season, and then there's a third guide for fall gardens. All of them are great. Uh, and what's good is a lot of these crops we can look at replanting again in the fall. Onions would be one that is not able to be replanted in the fall. So if we missed it this spring, then we don't get that second chance. But otherwise, things like spinach and broccoli are certainly things that can do well as fall crops in our area. So I always think that in our area, we can actually kind of do 3 seasons of gardening. We've got the early cool season, we've got our main season, and then we've got the fall garden. So we actually have good opportunities to grow plants. One plant that is actually not too late to plant that would be a cool season crop would be potatoes, or as folks in this region will often call these Irish potatoes to distinguish them from sweet potatoes. We can plant these very early. They are a frost tolerant crop, so there's a lot of folks who have the habit of planting them on St. Patrick's Day. So about mid-March in our region works well, but we can plant them all the way through the end of July. And in fact, if you were very much wanting to hold potatoes over to the next year to have potatoes all winter long and into spring of the next season, I'd encourage you to plant it towards the end of July because those later planted crops are harvested later, and that means less time in storage. So certainly some folks will do more than one crop of potatoes for that very reason. There are some pest problems that they can have on the insect side. Colorado potato beetle is a notable one. There's not a lot of good pesticide products for Colorado potato beetle. It's a challenge. It's kind of the poster child for actually insecticide resistance in that it very quickly acquires it. So there's a lot of home products that are available to gardeners that simply aren't effective on Colorado potato beetles. They just do not provide good control. But certainly there are some products that we could talk about using if you had some issues. There's actually a lot of varieties to try out there, and certainly some of these maybe aren't quite as novel as they once were. We quite frequently see things like purple or blue potatoes in the grocery store now, and once they were very unusual. But certainly there's a lot of opportunity to try something different. One thing about potatoes, we can make an early harvest on them. So immature potatoes, also called new potatoes, can be graveled. That's the term for it. And that's basically just harvesting them early. So rather than digging up the entire plant, typically you come along the side where you're hilling them up, dig in till you find some small potatoes and pull those out. What's good about new potatoes is their skins haven't begun to toughen, so it's a great treat out of the garden, and we can start getting those out about 8 weeks after we plant. So it is a way to have a little bit of an earlier harvest on potatoes before they reach full maturity. And so with that, don't want to take any more time. You see my email and my cell phone there on your screen. I will stop my share, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions outside of this class. And let me pull up the chat box and see if we got any questions in there. I'm not seeing any right now, but certainly if anybody has any, please feel free to drop those in.
Thank you, Adam. So I will go with my portion. So if you have not seen me before, I'm Elizabeth Renfro. I'm the Family Consumer Science Extension Agent with UT Extension, Washington County. So I'm going to talk about, kind of what to do after, you've harvested your vegetables from your garden or even fruit. And then I'm actually going to do a short demonstration for you all on how to use those items from your garden. So, keeping your bounty, what exactly should you do with it? And one big thing that most people will do is they will actually freeze their items. Okay, so some benefits of it is that it's very quick, it's easy, it's convenient, it's easy to serve, and it also preserves nutrient quality. Some other things that people do also is canning and drying their fruits and vegetables. And so if you're wanting to learn more about canning, there is a video about home canning, water bath canning, and pressure canning on our YouTube channel. But also, if you're wanting more of the hands-on type of class, we will actually be offering an in-person, hands-on home canning class this summer. So I'm partnering with Unicoi County to offer that. But when freezing things, you also have to think about what causes the quality loss of those items. And so enzymes are one big thing. They're naturally occurring substances in plants that help control the ripening process of it. And so freezing actually slows that down, but it doesn't actually stop the enzyme activities. And if you don't blanch your vegetables before freezing, you actually lose that quality. So think about corn that has been blanched versus unblanched. So if you mistakenly forgot to not blanch your corn before you stuck it in the freezer and you pulled it out and try to eat it now, it might not taste very good. A lot of people say that it has that very rancid type of flavor to it. And so typically most people will throw that away. Air is another thing that can cause quality loss. So excluding air prevents enzyme reactions and oxidation, which also causes surface browning. So it's very common in fruits, but also very prevalent in potatoes. Microorganisms is another thing. And so the sweet spot is at 40 to 140. So 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 140 degrees Fahrenheit is a sweet spot where most bacteria, mold, and yeast multiply very rapidly. And they multiply even rapidly at more of a room temperature. So think about where you like to be comfortable in your home, like that temperature. Most people around, 65 to 75 degrees, maybe a little bit warmer, depending on how warm you like it. And so that's kind of where microorganisms like to multiply very quickly, is at the kind of the same temperature as we like. So freezing doesn't actually kill most of the microorganisms. It just slows or prevents them from growing until they're unthawed again. and can begin growing again. So that's why it's important to make sure that you you thaw out your fruits and vegetables in the refrigerator. That's going to be your safest bet to thawing out your items, and even meats. Also, ice crystals are another thing, especially those large ice crystals. So small ice crystals are ideal, so they actually keep the desired texture of the food. Those larger ice crystals, they actually rupture the cells in that fruit or vegetable, so it causes that mushiness and that very soft texture that we really don't like. And so with smaller crystals, they actually happen when the food is frozen quickly and kept at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below at a constantly. And then of course, evaporation of moisture, which this leads to freezer burn. And it's because of poor packaging will cause the loss of that moisture. It'll also cause the loss of color, the flavor, and the texture. And if it's exposed to those freezer temperatures for too long without the proper packaging, it will lead to that freezer burn, like I said, which is the drying out of those plant fibers. So freezer burn is one of those that it's not harmful to you, it just doesn't taste very good. So most people typically will get rid of that item, especially if it's been freezer burned. So what exactly is blanching? And so when you are blanching, it's placing most vegetables in boiling water for a specific amount of time. And it's based off of that vegetable itself. And so it's important to have that correct time. And then you immediately take it and you place it in an ice water bath. And so this actually stops the cooking process. And so the blanching stops that enzyme process. And so it's important to do this. And one of the resources that you'll receive as a follow-up email is actually our Freezing Foods book from UT Extension. It'll have the different times that you need to blanch your vegetables for. So what exactly is the purpose of blanching? It's to improve the flavor, the color, the texture, the nutrient retention. It's also there to slow or even stop that enzyme activity. It helps cleanse that surface of that vegetable. It helps brighten the colors, specifically in green vegetables. So if you think about it, green beans is a good example. Green beans are one of those that they're kind of like a dull looking color when you harvest them, but then when you actually cook them, they become this very bright green. And then of course, when you're pressure canning them, they become more of like, I like to call it an army green color. And it'll actually wilt or soften vegetables in the blanching process. So with, Adam talks about onions and peppers in his presentation, and these items are actually things that don't need to be blanched. You can chop them up or dice them up, throw them in little freezer baggies, label them, of course, and then, just pull them out as needed. And so this is very helpful for like when you're making casseroles or if you're going to make stir fry, that type of thing, you can use these items in. So sweet potatoes, pumpkins, spaghetti, squash, and tomatoes, it's actually important to cook these before you freeze them. If you're freezing cauliflower and it's turning dark, you can add a tablespoon of lemon juice per quart of boiling water, and it'll help prevent that darkening of cauliflower. Excuse me. And tomatoes, you actually want to cook tomatoes. They can be frozen successfully. Raw tomatoes do not freeze well, and they actually become water and develop an off flavor. So it's important to make sure that you cook your tomatoes. And actually, tomatoes are one of the vegetables that you actually get more benefits from cooking it than eating it fresh or raw. So cooked tomatoes are more nutrient dense than actually fresh tomatoes. So it's important to do that. It helps release some of those important nutrients that you need. Some packaging tips for this. So of course you want to make sure that it's a freezer safe packaging. So if you are using bowls or the different types of plastic dishes or glass dishes, you want to make sure that it has this symbol on there. So this symbol here represents that it is a freezer safe package. You want to make sure that it's durable, it's leak proof, they're easy to seal and also easy to label. So if you're using like the plastic packaging, you can buy freezer tape so that it actually lasts, it holds up in the freezer, and you're able to write what is on there. Also make sure that if you are mixing things together in packaging into freezer packaging, make sure that you label what all is in there. So if it's peppers and onions, label that together, or if it's by itself, or did you add any salt or pepper or seasoning to it, that's going to be important to know that also. It's important to cool or actually chill your food before filling it into the package. And then also package in quantities of single meal served sizes. And so this is going to be important. You don't want to, if you're cooking for 1 or 2 people and you're putting everything in the gallon size bags, that may not be the ideal packaging. So you might want to go more towards the half gallon or pint size of freezer bags. And make sure that if you are using freezer bags, that it actually says freezer bags and not storage bags. They are different. Freezer bags are actually designed to be freezer safe and to actually help that quality and maintain that quality of that food product. Whereas storage bags are things that you're just going to put on the shelf, or if you're going to put chips or something like that for your lunch in. And you actually want to leave about a 1/2 inch headspace in your freezer container. And so this will help create a good seal for that. And then you'll be able to, drain out that air from that packaging. And so that's kind of leads us to our last point, is making sure that you press out the air. One of my things that I really like to use is a vacuum sealer. They're fairly inexpensive to purchase, especially if you do a lot of freezing. They're something that you want to invest in because it helps draw out a lot of that air from your packaging to prevent freezer burn. And then a little bit about potatoes and how to store them. And so potatoes are actually the second most consumed food in the US. Second only to, what do y'all think is the first one? Y'all put it in the chat what you think might be the first most consumed food in the US. So somebody says bread and tomato, lettuce, corn. Brownies, yeah. It's actually second only to dairy products. So yeah, if you're a cheese lover, if you're a milk lover, it's actually only second to that. But potatoes actually begin sprouting. So if you've ever stored potatoes in your house, you might see that they start sprouting. And they usually start sprouting about 30 to 140 days after they harvest it, depending on their variety. And so you want to actually put them or store them in a well ventilated area. Excuse me. So an unheated entrance, a spare room. A lot of people will put them in their basements or a garage that stays cool. I know in our house we actually have a potato like storage thing in our basement. So it's here and it's pretty neat. It's got its own little double doors. It stays very cool down there. So the ideal temperatures to store potatoes is 42 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you kind of think back to where we kind of keep our house at that anywhere from 65 to 75 degrees, depending on your hot nature, if you're a cool nature or hot nature, that's still not the ideal temperature. So you want to place it where it's well ventilated, where it's cool. So, and also that it's high humidity. So a lot of people will have a cellar that they place their items in. And then if you don't have that, you can actually increase the humidity in the location by placing pans of water in front of their air source. So it helps with that humidity. And it was saying in this source that I found this at, so University of Idaho, and you'll get that publication also, but they were saying that potatoes like, I think it's 90 to 95% relative humidity. And of course, we do not keep our homes at that humidity. And then storing them in a dark location or even in dark bags that are perforated. So they have those small holes in it. And you think about it, those that you purchase in the store are not dark bags. They're actually those clear bags so you can see the potatoes. And, that's because food processing does that because they know that people want to see what their food looks like. So that's the reason why they put them in the clear bag. All right. So at this time, if you've got any questions for myself or Adam, you can go ahead and ask those in the chat box. But I'm actually going to transition to my kitchen real quick. So if you guys give me a minute, if you want to, you can unmute yourself also and ask questions. But just give me a minute and I will be right back.
So Elizabeth, we did have one question pop in. It's a question for you. Okra, do you have to blanch it?
Okra, I would need to see. I've got to double check and make sure. It will be in that. I think you can blanch okra. It should be. Hold on real quick. Let me go stop my share. Okay, can y'all see me? Okay, so yeah, okra is, you do need to blanch it. So based off of their pod size. So if it's a smaller pod, it's for 3 minutes. If they're larger pods, then it's for 5 minutes. You'll blanch them, okay? And then that resource that you all will receive will have that information on there. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this on. But what I'm going to show you all today is actually easy breakfast muffins. So this is a good way to get your vegetables that you grow in your garden in fairly easy, and it's a good way to meal prep for the week. And so what I have here is I've got some broccoli. So I don't know if anybody else has ever put broccoli in with their eggs, cooked them with eggs. I've got tomatoes, I've got cooked spinach over here. I've got some green onions. I also have some sausage here. You can use bacon or you don't have to put any breakfast meat in there. And then I also have some diced up bell peppers here. Now, the easiest way to chop up broccoli, so you can see I have a head of broccoli here. Okay. A lot of times people will, break them off. They see that's the easiest way. But actually, if you take your knife and you just kind of cut the tops off. That's the easiest way to cut your broccoli. Okay, to get the little crowns off of them, the heads of broccoli. So for this, you don't need it to be very big, just because I am using about a normal size muffin tin here, okay? And before we actually get started, I'm gonna set my oven to 375. So we gotta preheat that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna cut up my broccoli, get that going. And you don't really need a lot. So if you do have excess, this is a good opportunity to even just chop it up and save it for later. You know, putting it either in a bag and freezing it, that's a good opportunity to do that also. So I've got some broccoli here and I'm just gonna place it in, actually, let me put cooking spray in here, okay? In each of my cups, or we're gonna have a fun time trying to get the eggs out of there, the egg muffin. So you don't need a lot in here because you are going to be stuffing it with other things. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make about 6 of these with some broccoli. I'm going to put a little bit of bell peppers in there with it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and put some more bell peppers in the other tins just to kind of get rid of that. And so the good thing about this is if you've got multiple people in your household, you can make little ones that each person likes. So if there's something that one doesn't like, you don't have to add that in there. So the next thing that I'm adding here is cooked spinach. Okay, so I'm putting a little bit in each one of those. All right, and then I've got some chopped up onion here. I'm gonna go ahead and put onion in here. You can use green onion, you can use sweet onion, yellow onion, white onion. A red onion is a very strong flavor. So if you do like a very strong flavor of onion, you can add that in there. And then I actually cooked up some sausage. So you can put some sausage in there. And you can see you don't need a lot. Okay, because we've got to put our egg in here too. All right. All right, so we got our sausage in there. And then if you want to add tomato, which I've got tomato here, actually got an heirloom tomato. The best way to cut up a tomato is actually use a serrated knife. Okay, so serrated knives are one of those that it doesn't, you know, if you've ever cut tomatoes with just a regular knife, it's hard. It mashes down your tomatoes. So using a serrated knife and using that sawing motion will be more beneficial. You'll get the better cut that you're looking for. So I'm just gonna cut this up. Now, if you're wanting a tomato that has a lot of meat to it, Roma tomatoes are the best. And Roma tomatoes are one of those that we recommend if you are planning on doing canning, that you grow Roma tomatoes. Now, if you're looking for something to make a tomato sandwich during the summertime, of course, using your heirlooms or big boy types. But of course, Adam can explain more about that and how to grow those. And of course, we're doing a salsa class, and you know, salsa, the main base of it is tomatoes. So of course, we'll go more into that during that time. And I'm gonna go ahead and put a couple more pieces in there. All right, okay. And then I'm going to take some cheese. All right, we're gonna add a little bit of cheese to each of these. You can add it to the top or you can add it directly into the muffin tin. Okay, so if you're one that has a dairy intolerance, you don't have to add cheese, but this is what it looks like so far without our egg mixture yet. So our egg mixture, and I've already cracked them up and, mixing them up. And so you want it mixed very well. And you notice I have a bowl here that has a pour on it. This is going to be a lot easier to use, and you're going to have more control putting it into the muffin tins. If you don't have a bowl like this, you can actually use a liquid measuring cup, and it'll give you easier control in putting that in there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add about 2 turns, maybe 3 turns of black pepper in here, and then a couple of turns for salt in there. Okay, and we're just going to mix that up really well. You want to make sure that your egg whites and your yolks are mixed. And so this is what I've used is a dozen eggs for that. Okay. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to pour it in here. And you want to pour it just to the top of your vegetables. And you got to give it time to kind of sink in and get in between. And then you're able to go back and add more if you need to. So this is good if you like to meal prep, to do this on the weekends or the day that you're meal prepping. And so you can just grab and go. Vegetables are one thing that most people have a hard time getting into their regular daily eating plans. So this is a good way to get that in, especially for breakfast. So basically, it's about 1 egg per tin. So if you're doing, multiple muffin tins of this, it's about 1 egg per tin. So I've got 12 here, so I've got to wait for my my oven to finish preheating. So I'm going to set this to the side. And I'm going to show y'all a easy way to dry your potatoes. So when you cook fresh potatoes, you want to soak them in cold water to get out any of that excess starch. So the starch is what makes the water cloudy. You also, when you cut up potatoes, you want to make sure that you put it in cold water to prevent it from turning pink. And then you drain it out, when it gets really cloudy, and then you put fresh cold water in it again. And then you'll notice that this one didn't get very cloudy, but I have a salad spinner here. And so actually what I'm going to do is to get any excess water out of there is I'm going to use my salad spinner. Okay. So that will help get out any excess water. And then of course you can pat it dry if you need to. So you'll see the excess water in there, and then you're able to cook up your potatoes. So you can do this when they are, if you plan on doing it like a hash brown, or if you like to do cube type potatoes, this is an easy way to get that excess water out of there. Okay. So I'm going to transition back to my computer. So if y'all have got any questions, I'll be right back. All right. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so are there any questions? You're welcome, Mary. So I will share with you all the resource that you will receive as one of your in the email. And it is the freezing foods from UT Extension. We also have these as a hard copy if you like to have a hard copy. Of course, you all are going to get the digital copy of this. And so it talks a lot about what I discussed today. And then if you actually have specific vegetables that you're wanting to freeze, it'll have on here the individual blanching times, and you'll see each of the different types of vegetables have different blanching times. So, Chinese cabbage or just cabbage is 1.5 minutes compared to like corn. A large ears of corn is like 11 minutes. So you can see there's a wide range of different times. So this will be very helpful for you all to reference back to. You're welcome, Allison. Is there any other questions for myself or Adam? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to share my screen for the last time. Hold on. Pull up the PowerPoint. There it is. Okay. So just to kind of finish us off, you will, in your follow-up email, have a link to a survey that Adam and myself would really appreciate for you to complete. It's very short. It should take you less than 2 minutes to complete. And then, of course, there is an area there if you've got any ideas for additional classes that you'd like for us to do with each other or separately. And then, of course, our next Garden to Table series class is a stir fry garden. And that one will be on May 10th at 6:30 p.m. also. And then our final one will be 2 weeks after that, and that will be our salsa garden class. But if you've got any questions for myself, you can reach out to me. Here's my email, and then also you can contact our office phone number and ask for myself or Adam. That's another way to get a hold of both of us. And then, of course, feel free to visit our website at washington.tennessee.edu. And then follow us on Facebook. We post a lot of our classes and events there to join us, okay? But thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.